when I was 18. They wouldn't draft me when I was 17 when I graduated from high school, so I had to wait a year. In the meantime, I worked at the auto ordnance plant in Bridgeport making the Thompson submachine guns. Then I received my letter, greetings, and you are to report to New Haven for induction. And on a specific date, and that's where I became then a member of the armed forces.
Okay, before we get into going into the service, let's back up a little bit and talk about your home life, where you grew up, what was like the life at home, and a little bit about, you didn't speak English, I believe, for a period of time. Talk about those things.
All right. When my mother took me to register for school, which was approximately just a block away, public school, she says, "You're in the United States and you are going to go to public school." Because we lived directly across the street from St. Stephen's School, which is a Catholic school, and she said, "No, you are going to the public school where you will meet all different kinds of people." So she took me to Longfellow School, which is in the west end of Bridgeport. And she wanted to enroll me in kindergarten. And she informed the principal that I was not able to speak English, but only Hungarian, because we were raised really by our grandparents. It was Depression time, and both my parents were out working, so the grandparents raised me. So the principal explained that they used to have an interpreter who would work with these non-English speaking people. However, she said, "We don't have that interpreter anymore, so I'm going to promote John immediately to the first grade." So I missed kindergarten completely. And so in a matter of 6 months, Miss Ward was my teacher, and she taught me English, not necessarily all in the classroom, but she would tutor me after school, before school, and so on, because we were only a block away from the school. But I'll never forget her. And of course, eventually, I was speaking quite well and quite literate, not only in speaking, but also in reading. But thank you, Miss Ward.
Very nice. Okay. Let's go into now, you go into the service, and where did you start? Where did it all begin? What was the training?
All right. When I was inducted, which was in New Haven, they then told me that I was to report for boot camp. Now, originally, when they asked me, well, which branch of the service would you want to be in? And of course, they had all 5 representatives at this table. And so I said, I want the U.S. Army. And this one of these officers said to me, "Are you sure you want the U.S. Army?" I said, "Yes, because I've been thinking about it." "Well, look, before we decide, why don't you go over into that section and just take a minute and think about it, because we have other branches of service here." So I did. They called me back. "All right, now have you thought about it?" Because they gave me a little composite sheet which explained everything about Coast Guard, the Air Force, etc. So I said, well, I'm going to stick with the U.S. Army. Son, you better go over and think about this because you're going to be making a momentous decision that will affect your life for quite a while. So I had to go off to the side again for the third time. When I came back, they said, all right, now, have you made another decision? I said, no, I'm now thinking in terms of what I read on your composite sheet, and I believe I'm going to select the United States Coast Guard. Oh, I think you've made an excellent choice. So I knew which officer was the Coast Guard. All right, and now, for your training, you will be reporting to Manhattan Beach, New York, which of course is not that far from where we live. And so I began training there, and I was there until November of 1943. We went through all kinds of, naturally, physical training because they expected all of that. But the Coast Guard also, at that time, had a reputation for dealing in small boats at perilous shorelines and so on, where they had to send Coast Guard people in to save people and also take them off foundering vessels, etc. And so that was also part of the training which they had at Manhattan Beach because there was a shoreline there, and they would create these kinds of situations. So that is why I was there that length of time from induction until November of 1943. All right, now comes time, and they wanted to know, did I have any preference? And so as to what branch now. So they want to know what my high school experience was. I explained that I had had some accounting courses. I also had typing and things of that nature. So they decided that I really would be an asset on any ship with that kind of background, because I could either become a yeoman, a storekeeper, anything involving accounting, anything involving keeping records and that type of thing. I said, fine, I can do that. So they said, well, you are going to then be assigned to headquarters, USS Coast Guard headquarters in New York on Broadway. I said, oh, well, that sounds very good because that's not going to be too far from home. Well, what I didn't know at the time, but I found out several years later, is that I was with 4 other, probably similar in experience, young guys. One was from Oklahoma, another one was from Detroit, another one was from New York, and the 4th one was really close by in Connecticut at Mystic. So we were all told to report now to this conveyance vehicle that was going to take us to Coast Guard headquarters on Broadway in New York. We arrive there at the headquarters, and we go in and we're ready to report to the officer of the day. And so he looks on his sheet, he says, we don't have any record that you're supposed to be here. What we know is that you are supposed to be going to Bayonne, New Jersey, and you are going aboard the USS Samuel Chase. We had absolutely no idea what the USS Samuel Chase was or anything else. And of course, the five of us are talking about, what happened, what happened. We never found out until several years later that the guys we were supposed to be replacing at headquarters managed to change the order, and we were hijacked, in essence, to the USS Samuel Chase.
Okay, so you're reporting to the USS Samuel Chase. Now,
Right.
talk about the ship when you first see it. What does it look like, and what type of ship is it?
Actually, when we reported aboard ship, by this time we had spent so much time in New York trying to decide whether we were going to be at the headquarters or not. By the time we got to Bayonne, New Jersey, it was 11 o'clock at night. And of course, all we could see were the lights going up the gangplank, which we had to climb. We really couldn't see the ship itself. However, we managed to get up to the top of the gangplank, asked the officer of the day for permission to come aboard, which he granted, except for Jimmy Gentili, who was immediately back of me from Detroit. And as he goes to salute and say, "Welcome aboard," and he has his sea bag on this shoulder, all of a sudden the sea bag slipped off the shoulder and went down into the drink. So he's there crying, actually crying. Remember, we were 18. What am I going to do? All of my uniforms, everything I own is in that sea bag. Don't worry, we'll fish it out, and then you'll have to get it dried out the next day. So the next morning, they give him this sea bag, which by this time is soaked. And we lay everything out in the shower room on the level of the shower room floor. And he's there trying to sort all of his things out. Fortunately, none of the rest of us did that. So we had our sea bags all set. And we were sent down into the third level of this ship. Now, we had never been even having a chance yet to see the outside of the ship. Anyway, we finally got up to breakfast because bosun would always pipe whatever was to happen that day. So he piped for breakfast. We recognized all those sounds because we had that training in boot camp. So we go up to the cafeteria and we have our breakfast, and Bryson, who is the chief of the general recruit group, and everybody called him Snake Bryson because he was supposed to be so tough. And he was really not a great big man. He was a fairly short guy. But for some reason or other, he found that incident with Jim dropping a sea bag off, and he knew we were really raw recruits. So he took a liking to us. But he was very mean to everybody else, but not to the five of us. We were his friends now, which we found to be very interesting. Anyway, Snake Bryson took us under his wing, and eventually he knew what we were really interested in. So Jim Gentili wanted to be a radio man. He was the one who dropped the sea bag. The kid from Tulsa wanted to be a yeoman. Paul from New York, he really didn't care, but he thought maybe he wanted to be a coxswain in one of these little invasion craft, the LCVP, which would carry the troops into the beaches and so on. So he became a student in that area. Cunningham, who was the kid from Tulsa, ended up being a yeoman. And so, let's see, I think I've got everybody else straightened out. Yes, and then I myself had selected to be a storekeeper. So now, within 2 days, the ship then was directed to head for Halifax and join a convoy to go overseas. And we were to go from Halifax to Glasgow, Scotland. We didn't know why, but that's where we ended up. We sailed up the River Clyde to Halifax, and we began training at that time troops for the landings which eventually would be at Omaha Beach, Normandy. But because we were that distance away from the channel, the Germans never knew we were up there training troops, because we were up hidden in Scotland, in Glasgow, which was on the western side, even away from anywhere near where German scouting planes and so on might. There were also beaches up there which we were able to use then for the training of the troops. And the troops were coming from anywhere in the United States, and we would work with them for several weeks each one. From November now, of the end of November of 43, until we were then told to head for Plymouth, England on the Channel. And this was at the end of May. But we knew eventually it must be then close to invasion time. But of course we did not know any of the details of that. Neither did anybody else, because when we were sent down there to Plymouth, in essence, the ship was sealed, and this ship was an APA, or Amphibious Personnel Assault Ship. We knew that eventually we would be carrying 1,000 troops in addition to our crew, which was 500, and that would be the essential total group that would be heading then for eventually the invasion of Europe. That's all we knew, invasion of Europe. So, and that was also interesting because once they sent the 1st U.S. Army Division to our ship, 1,000 guys, we knew we had to make arrangements to feed not only the crew of 500, but these Army people, which numbered 1,000. Well, my officer, whose name was Lieutenant Cooper, decided that I should head up, because he knew what my training was in accounting and so on, and you should then begin making plans for making up the order list for the amount of food that we're going to need. For example, flour, sugar, and so on for the bakery, because we had a full-time bake shop aboard. And then we had guys who would then be in charge of the meat section, all the butchers and so on. So I had to make visits around to all these various groups to get their orders as to what I should order, because I had never done this before. Now remember, Bob, this was the time before computers, so I was doing all of this manually.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the USS Samuel Chase? A little bit about its history and something about the ship itself.
All right. The USS Samuel Chase was a ship approximately 500 feet long. So we would consider her to be a moderate-sized ship as compared to cruisers or the larger Navy vessels. And that was interesting because the USS Samuel Chase was really a Navy ship. At that time, the Navy was short on recruits to man all of these APAs, and so they turned to the Coast Guard and asked the Coast Guard if we would accept the complete command of this ship, and we would be responsible for maintaining the ship and seeing to it that whatever the duties that were assigned, we would carry them out. So there was one other ship also that was Coast Guard manned, but this was completely Coast Guard manned. And we became really a very close family. We were 500 crew, but I knew a lot of the people because I was a storekeeper, and especially since I was involved with feeding all these people, I knew most of them aboard ship, who are still, some of them, my best friends to this day. So,
what was a storekeeper?
A storekeeper was assigned the duties of maintaining complete resupplying every time we were low on anything, whether it was ammunition, whether it was food, which is what I was involved with, or any kind of paraphernalia involved seamanship and so on, including the equipment needed for the quartermasters, who of course were responsible for knowing where and when we were going, and especially in this case maintaining our own course when we were in convoy leaving Halifax and heading for Scotland at the time.
So you were trained as a storekeeper, and now your first move from Bayonne was to go up to Halifax, and during that time you're operating as the storekeeper.
Yes.
You get to Halifax, and is that where you joined a convoy?
Yes.
Talk about the convoy itself and that treacherous journey across the Atlantic.
We, at that point, were in Halifax among several other ships, including Liberty ships at that time. And I don't know if you know anything about Liberty ships, but they were these ships that were quickly put together really to carry equipment, not to carry any kind of large contingent of men and so on. And however, we were then going to cross the North Atlantic, which of course we knew was filled with the German U-boats, because they were even at the time off the east coast of the United States, in and around New York, waiting to, and as a matter of fact, they sunk a couple of ships, and I don't know the names of those ships or anything like that. But anyway, we knew this was going to be a perilous journey. We also knew we had a large escort of destroyers, cruisers, and even one very large battleship that led the convoy. They had a lot more equipment, they had a lot more firepower than any of us did. However, the Chase, as well as some of the other APAs, had 3-inch guns forward, 3-inch guns aft, 20 millimeter guns on the bridge level, and so we had some basic armor that would at least we could fend off any immediate air attacks. So our convoy now is heading out into the North Atlantic. I myself felt pretty safe with all these other warships around us and so on, and they all had better communications at that time than we did. So I really was not concerned about that crossing at all, and it wasn't that long, maybe 2 days, from Halifax, which was the shortest distance then to Scotland. We arrive now in Scotland, sail up the River Clyde, and we anchor, and we also dock in Glasgow. We were then told that we were going to be training troops for the invasion of Europe. No other information other than that. And we were training in 2 little towns, one on each side of Glasgow, one was Gorick and the other one was Greenock. And so we knew they also had beaches that would be similar to beaches wherever these landings were going to be. And of course the Germans were sure we were going to be crossing from Calais and ending up near the northern part of France, nowhere near these actual beaches where we ended up. So,
how long a period of time were you docked there, and were you able to get off the ship? Did you go into town? And what kinds of things did you do?
Yeah, we were there from the end of November until the end of May. So we were there for a considerable length of time. Very often we would have liberty. You had to take turns. They couldn't send everybody off at the same time. So we would go into Glasgow. The first place we'd go to is the USO. There was always entertainment there by various groups and so on. Nobody famous that I knew, but certainly American entertainers. And one of the things that Jim Cunningham and I did was to take a trip out of Glasgow up to Loch Lomond. So the 2 of us climbed the highest mountain there called Mount Tarbot. We thought this was great experience. Also a very interesting thing for us to see, other than to be hanging around in a bar all day. So that was one of the things that we did. Also in Glasgow, in addition to the USO, we could attend 1 or 2 of the theaters, which were more like music halls, more like the British music halls. For example, we saw Sir Harry Lauder, who was one of the great Scots entertainers, at one of those Glasgow theaters and so on. So we did a lot of interesting things like that, other than just sitting around in a bar, which is what many of them did. But
you would return to the ship?
Oh yes, these were just day visits. We then had to return to the ship.
You slept on the ship.
And we slept on the ship all the time.
Any threats, whether air, sea, anything happened that you were any concern?
There were no attacks, there were no concerns when we were in Glasgow. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I was going to bring with me today, and I didn't, somewhere in the archives up in my attic, is a picture of me taken at the USO in Scottish kilts, which I will get to you eventually. Anyway.
So the point here is you're continuing to train for the invasion
of Europe.
Second,
Second
what is during all this, what is your job?
My job was simply to be on board, to be sure I was feeding all of these troops, that I was feeding all of our crew, and so on. Because, you see, eventually at ports like Glasgow, there were supply ships that came from the United States, and I would have to go over in the captain's boat with my list to one of the supply ships, and then they would in turn take the list and tell me once they had the total completed, they would ship it to my ship.
So you didn't have to personally get the materials and bring them back?
No.
During the training exercises, you mentioned there were beaches similar to Normandy.
Which we didn't know.
Okay. Were you able to see the practice landings? Were you watching them?
No, no. I had two jobs aboard ship. The first job, and the important job, was my battle station. But my other job required me constantly to be aboard ship administering the supplies that the bake shop would need, the butcher shop would need, and so on. So I really had no time to go watch these maneuvers. But my friends, some of whom were coxswains, would come back and tell me all about it.
When being involved with supplies, does that mean that people in the bake shop and so forth would constantly be coming to you saying, John, I need this or I need that?
Right, I'm out of this and I'm out of that.
So you would be sort of on call all the time?
Yeah.
To get supplies?
Yeah, I had my own office next to Jim Cunningham, who was a yeoman, and his main job was to be sure that they were being issued checks, or chits as we called them, their pay. In every case, that was his responsibility, to be sure all of the crew members were paid and paid on time.
So you would pay, talk about this a minute, you would pay what, monthly, weekly?
No, monthly.
Monthly. Were you given cash or?
No, it was really in check form, or what we call chits.
Okay.
Yeah. We could, when we would get to shore eventually, convert them to cash, and then we could not mail them home, but wire them home, which is what I would do, because I didn't like to, not all of it, I would keep a certain amount of money that I would need for normal expenses.
You would have normal day-to-day expenses.
Yeah.
That you would need some cash.
Yeah. If I wanted to go to the barber shop to get a haircut, I'd have to pay for that. If I wanted to go to the ship store where they would sell things like candy bars or soda, etc., etc. And that was another job that somebody else had, and he had to maintain all of that.
And you had to supply that person too.
Yes.
You brought up something about sending money home. You said you were sending money home. Talk about communicating back home. How did you communicate? Who were you communicating with, and so forth?
Well, I was communicating mainly with my mother and father through what was then known as V-mail. So we would write out in cursive writing on kind of a medium-sized folio paper, and that in turn would then be reduced into something called V-mail, which is about that size, maybe 6 by 4. I still have some emails that I had sent to my wife. She at that point was in college up in central Connecticut. So she would get emails, my parents would get emails.
You are saying female.
Females, yeah.
Yes. Oh, so she still has some of the original ones that you sent.
Yes.
Let's pick up on your training. Oh, go ahead.
Before we go on to that, all of those females, of course, had to go through be censored. And so many of the females, of course, were blacked out, because, for example, when we were in the Pacific and I mentioned that I was in sick bay with the cat fever, which is a normal South Pacific extra more than the normal temperature would be, but high temperature. Well, that was blacked out because if they knew that somebody was in sick bay with cat fever, that would give them an indication that we were in the South Pacific.
You're finishing up now your training exercise in preparation, and now we're talking about it's 1944 now.
Right.
And let's pick up at this point. When do you begin to realize this is it? This is the invasion.
We begin to realize that when we sailed from Glasgow to Plymouth, England.
Are you told anything?
Not yet.
Okay.
And between Plymouth and the next harbor, which was Portsmouth, we were in either one because eventually we had to move from one to the other for some reason which we were not aware of, but they were positioning these ships, these various APAs, because you were either going to hit Omaha Beach, Utah Beach, whatever, because it was a Canadian beach, a British beach, and then there were two beaches where the United States troops were going to be. But at that time, we were not given that information. Not until we began to take on the troops. Then we knew. Now, that was really beginning at the end of May and maybe June 1st, June 2nd. The time frame is really unsure at that time as far as we knew. We didn't know what was going on in the background because Eisenhower was the supreme commander of all of the forces. Remember, there was a big debate whether or not it was going to be the British general or the American general named as supreme commander. Fortunately, Roosevelt really put the pressure on Churchill and reminded him of all of the troops that we would be sending from the United States, so we really deserved to be in charge of the entire operation. So Eisenhower was head of Supreme Headquarters of Expeditionary Forces. So now we're either in Plymouth or Portsmouth. And we begin to take on the troops around the 3rd of June. Now we take on the United States Army 1st Division, which was one of the premier divisions. 1,000 troops. They were great guys, and we became great friends. You know, they had, when they first came on board, they were eating C rations or K rations, and we would go down and we would get fresh fruit from my supplies, and we'd trade our fresh fruit for the C rations because we wanted to see what was in these C rations. We now have loaded on our 1st Division troops, and automatically then our ship is now sealed. Nobody leaves that ship. Nobody else comes on board. And of course, as far as we knew yet, we're still awaiting word from Eisenhower. So, we're in Plymouth Harbor, and that would be the next day, which would be
Probably the
the 4th. All of a sudden, we hear our very loud call to general quarters, which we knew we had to go and report to our battle stations immediately. Drop everything, whatever we were doing. Get to your battle stations. What we didn't know was there is a German plane carrying delayed action mines. How did they get there? They came under the radar and snuck under the radar, and before we knew it, this German plane was going back and forth between the ships that were anchored there, including ours. Well, as he would go by on the port side, you could see the interior and the cockpit of this German. And of course, as he came around to the other side, all the time dropping these delayed action mines. And as he came by my side, I could see him, and as he went by, he went, I dove for cover behind the armor. And of course, I could see him laughing up there. Because he had to know that a lot of us were new recruits, really. And so that was an experience. Well, the next morning, of course, these delayed action mines began going off, and fortunately, the British minesweepers were right there, and they managed to clear that harbor. They knew they had to, because they knew it was imminent that we'd all be taking off for France fairly soon as Eisenhower made up his mind, as soon as his weatherman gave him an okay. But before we even left the harbor heading for France, we were distributed this full-page letter from Eisenhower. Every crew member got a copy of it, and I had brought 2 copies with me coming down up here to Connecticut. But one of my nephews, my niece really, has a daughter who is going to France to live with a French couple for a couple of months in her senior high school year. And so she had written ahead of time and wanted me to give her some information about my experiences in France. So I brought a copy of this message from Eisenhower, and I had a second copy which was for you. Well, Rebecca has a younger brother, Joey, and of course he's listening as I'm giving Rebecca all this background which she wanted, specifically about France and Normandy, because she's going there to visit. So here's this younger kid, Joey, and he's looking as I'm giving her all this information, and he sees this thing from Eisenhower. And so I said, Would you like one, Joey? Oh, yes, I want one. That was your copy. So I'm going to be mailing your copy when I get home. I couldn't say no to this kid.
I don't blame
Anyway, now we're really getting close now to Normandy. And so you'll find another sheet there that I've given you is my recollection of D-Day. I kept a little diary, which we were not supposed to do because they were concerned that it might fall into somebody's hands and then the cat would be out of the bag and so on. But from that little diary that I had, you have a full page of my recollections of D-Day. So now we're heading across the channel, and fortunately by this time the American Air Force had neutralized the Luftwaffe, so we really had no fear of being attacked by any planes. We had some information about what the Germans called not U-boats but E-boats, which were a surface boat, not like a U-boat. And there were supposed to be many of those in and around Calais, which is where they expected us to land. Well, fortunately, we were beside Le Havre, and so we missed all of that. I think that's the sheet, the recollection sheet. So, and we leave at something like 3 o'clock in the morning, and we arrive off the beaches, and immediately here are these 3 warships cruising back and forth along the shoreline, bombarding the shoreline. And so Eisenhower gives the word. It is now June the 6th, and we began to launch our LCVP.
Did you actually recall hearing that Eisenhower speech about embarking on this great crusade?
Yeah, we had copies of it.
Okay.
And we were each distributed a copy of it.
Oh, I see.
By that time.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
tension must have been a lot of tension.
A lot of tension, because of course when we arrived there it was dark. We knew there were these 3 battleships because you could see just from the firing of their guns an outline of each one of them. We didn't know the names of the ships at that time. However, we then get word to begin loading. Now, our captain, who really was a very brilliant guy, quite unlike the other ships where these troops, now they're loaded with all kinds of equipment, rifle, their backpacks and everything, they had to climb down rope ladders to get into these Higgins boats or LCVPs. Each one of those little boats carried approximately 45 soldiers, plus there were 3 crew members, coxswain and his 2 crew members, to run these little Higgins boats. Not our captain. He wasn't going to have these poor soldiers with all that equipment. He decides that we were going to load our troops at the rail. So our booms would pick up X number of, maybe 3 on each side, on the side of the ship that we're going to use to launch. And our troops only had to climb over the rail and get into these boats. And then we would lower the boats. And they would just circle around until all of the ones that we wanted to go. And there would be a lead boat. And so they headed for the beach. we could then hear the firing of German 88 guns, which
Did you see the beach?
no, we couldn't see the beach, but we could hear all of this ruckus going on. And the German 88s were at each end of Omaha Beach, crisscrossing fire. So we knew those poor kids were going to get it as soon as they stepped ashore. One of the people who came to our last reunion, which was in North Carolina, was a member of the 1st Division that landed on the beach that day. And before he got too far in, he was wounded 6 times and then fell, and then of course there were corpsmen to take care of him and so on, and they shipped him back really to our ship, which eventually became a hospital ship to take on the wounded and the dead. Anyway, this guy, we made an honorary member of our association, so he had been to other reunions with us. And so he was just thrilled to be at the last one, and he was thrilled to be still alive after having been wounded 6 times on Omaha Beach. But there were so many of those young kids who were just slaughtered by these 88 guns. At that point, the beach master, who was in charge of Omaha Beach, notified our ship that they may have to send the boats back because he was going to suggest that we withdraw from the beach in order to save the people who were still alive. Well, just then, not just then, but a little while before that, the Rangers, which were specialists at climbing cliffs and so on, they were going to try to get to Pont du Hoc, which is one of the highest points above Omaha Beach. How they got there, because they couldn't use the regular equipment to climb at that point, because they were afraid that they would be exposed too quickly to the German people who were still firing those German 88s. They used ladders that they could kind of use in a way that they were not exposed. The ladders they borrowed from London's fire department, and we carried some on our ship and other ships carried, but we also knew that we were going to try to take Pont du Hoc, or the Rangers were going to do it. Once the Rangers got on top of Pont du Hoc, they could see these German 88 guns, and using a German gun that they captured up there, they obliterated those German 88s. So the beach master said, delay the order to evacuate. Your troops are going to be okay. And so we stayed. And that was an interesting point, because I had never really known about Pont du Hoc until we visited Omaha Beach this last time.
As the day developed, 6th of June, when the sun comes up,
now we could see.
now you can see. You see the shore, you can see the number of ships and so forth. Describe what that scene was like.
Well, it was, for me, it was just an immense group of all kinds, including warships, including these troop ships, supply ships, what have you. 4,000 ships massed at Omaha Beach, never mind the other beaches, because the British had their own beach, the Canadians had their own, and so on. So we were all just flabbergasted that we were involved in the middle of these 4,000 ships. One interesting thing was, if you ever saw the movie Saving Private Ryan, at the beginning they showed a scene from these 4,000 ships. I think they must have gotten a copy of the newsreel or whatever it was and used that in their film just to depict this, because it kind of took your breath away to see all this and to think that we were a part of it.
You said the wounded were coming back to your ship and you became a hospital ship. You had doctors then aboard?
We had a full complement of doctors to take care of any wounded. The dead were stored just around and beneath our 3-inch guns, for which I was the fire control officer. And as more dead arrived, they were just piling them up like cords of wood. Finally, the men who were from sick bay and who were in charge, pharmacist mates, were in charge of sewing these dead bodies into canvas bags. My officer, who knew at this point that I wasn't going to be relaying any fire control to anybody, he says, "You go over and help those pharmacist mates." So I began to do the same thing, putting dead bodies into these canvas bags, keeping their dog tags on the outside so that we could identify them later on. And so the next day we sailed back to Plymouth Harbor and we unloaded our wounded and we unloaded our dead.
Unloaded the dead where?
On the dock, and then a British contingent, and I don't know what they called their Red Cross, it was similar to the Red Cross, came along and they took the bodies to wherever they wanted to be sure that they were identified and so on.
So this is maybe the 6th, 7th?
7.
7. You're back. You went back.
Now we're sailing back to Plymouth Harbor.
Okay. Was there? What was your responsibility after that?
My responsibility was to maintain food services for the crew, because by then we weren't carrying any more troops. Until a few days later, they decided to move our ship into the Mediterranean. And so we were sent to Oran, Africa, and Mers El Kabir, which is in Morocco. We were picking up French troops to bring to Marseille to join General Patton's army, because he was covering the southern flank of the invasion group instead of the northern group, which were all from the beaches. We also, we had to make a second trip because we didn't have all of those French colonial troops aboard. That was not too long of a trip, so we really didn't have to feed them. They were fed before they left and once they got to Marseille. But we were then sent to Naples, Italy. And we were to pick up a contingent of Italian troops that were going to join Patton's army, because they really at this point forgot Mussolini and his group and so on, and they really
Italian troops that were going to join
Patton's army, yeah. In other words, they really were escaping from the Italian army, which they didn't think too much of. But they knew, and they had heard about General Patton. So after that trip to Naples and to Africa, they decided we were to sail back through Gibraltar and go back to Boston, and eventually ended up, they sent us down to Norfolk for some basic repairs where we might have done something wrong or some damage was done to the ship.
Was there any major damage on the ship?
None. We were so fortunate. We were never hit by any airstrike. We escaped quite handily. When the ship was going through Gibraltar for the first time, there was a U-boat waiting outside Gibraltar, and he let go of one of his torpedoes, which sailed between the bow of our ship and the anchor chain. Missed us completely, but it could have done a tremendous amount of damage. So that's why our ship was labeled the Lucky Chase, because we really escaped in all those invasions: Sicily, North Africa, Italy, Normandy, southern France, never hit. And so we were known as the Lucky Chase. So then we went down, did some minor repair work, and then we had to sail through the Panama Canal. And we were sailing now to Pearl Harbor. From Pearl Harbor, we joined another convoy, escorted completely by cruisers and destroyers, to Okinawa. And we were near the entrance to Bruckner Bay at that point, and we knew again we had troops aboard ship, not 1,000 this time, because there were so many extra ships that they were split up, because of course they were afraid of kamikaze planes. At that time, that's what the Japanese were doing. We weren't afraid of Japanese E-boats or U-boats or whatever. We were concerned about the kamikaze planes, because they would just dive into the superstructure of any ship and of course either set them on fire or really obliterate them, at least the top side, and decommission them. In effect, they couldn't operate anymore. They were really heading kamikaze pilots for large ships like the cruisers, like the battleships, also aircraft carriers, because they wanted to do the most damage that they could do.
So you did see some kamikaze?
Oh yeah, they flew by.
But they weren't coming after your ship?
No, but we were at general quarters all the time, and we were firing at these kamikaze pilots, even though they weren't anywhere near us, because they were heading for bigger fish at that point. However, we didn't particularly feel that safe from kamikaze pilots, because you never knew if one of them would veer off and hit one of our ships.
So you're off of Okinawa now.
Yeah.
That was the Battle of Okinawa.
Yeah.
Which certainly there were a number of kamikazes that were involved in that battle.
Oh yeah.
And were you taking on wounded then too?
No, not yet, because from there we withdrew from Bruckner Bay, which is where we entered Okinawa, and as we came out of there, the ship accidentally hit a shoal and ripped a hole in the bottom of the hull. So we were immediately dispatched to Pearl Harbor for repairs. So we were taken away from that battle scene completely. We got to Pearl Harbor, and they were so busy repairing other ships that got there before we did that we were sent on to San Diego for repairs. And so that's what happened. And then from San Diego, we eventually were sent back to WWII, which was one of the southernmost islands, or group of islands, called the Caroline Islands, which were the nearest point to Japan, and from which we could then launch planes and so on. And I don't know whether the Enola Gay was actually launched from there. I really don't know that story. Oh, okay. That was another one that was near us.
So what was your job? What was your job, the ship job, during? I mean, there weren't landings.
No, we were supposed to be landing troops at Okinawa, and because we landed, our troops took off, and they were gone. Our boats, our LCVPs, came back to our ship without picking anybody up because whatever Captain Heimer decided at that time thought we'd better get out of there because he was concerned about the kamikaze planes. And that's when we hit the shoal, and because of the hole in our hull, we were sent back to Pearl Harbor and then on to San Diego for repairs.
So, when, toward the end of the war, I think you were aware that there was preparation for the invasion of Japan. Did you ever hear anything about it, and were you going to be involved in that?
No, we were not going to be involved with that because before we even knew about the possibility of being involved, Harry Truman made the decision to drop the atomic bomb. We knew then and there that would be it, no more. What we did do, however, when the war was over and they were going to sign the peace treaty with Japan on the USS Missouri, because that's where Harry Truman was from, we had to take the first troops into Yokohama, and they were landed there. It wasn't that far of a distance, but we always took great pride in saying we were the ones that took the first troops in. And after that, we were then sent to pick up more troops from one of these islands and take them to Sapporo, Japan, which is the northern island, Otaro, and land them there. And from there, our ship was sent to Tsingtao, China, where we picked up a Marine detachment that had been held prisoners there throughout all that wartime. And we had to take them to safety.
Japanese prisoners?
No, our Marine detachment that was at Tsingtao, China. When the Japanese, of course, invaded China, the Marine detachment was there, and they were also taken prisoner and held there. But we picked them up and took them to safety. And from then on...
These are Marines that had been prisoners for like 3 or 4 years.
Oh, yeah.
What did they look like?
Emaciated, kind of beaten down. They managed to maintain their sanity.
You never got your feet on the ground in Japan, and you never got off the ship?
Oh, yes.
Oh, you did?
When we took that group up to Sapporo, Japan, the northernmost island, we were all issued sidearms. We were given strict instructions. Do not enter any of the Japanese homes. Do not eat any of their food. Do not even try to associate with anybody. Just go ashore, look around, and then get back to the ship. So that was our extent.
The war in Europe then occurred.
Yes.
Where were you when you heard the war in Europe was over?
Okay. I was on the island of Ulithi, which was a part of the Caroline Islands, when we got word. And this was shortly thereafter the atomic bombs were dropped.
And what about the war in Japan? Where were you when you heard that occurred?
Well, that was within days after the atomic bomb, and I believe it was the emperor himself who came for the signing with MacArthur aboard that ship. No? We were told that.
But anyway,
Was it Tojo?
representative. But anyway, okay, so the war has ended now, but it hasn't ended for you. You still have a job to do, which is what?
Which is carrying on my normal, regular duties other than being at general quarters and being at my battle station. We still had to maintain the battle stations because they didn't have any idea when and where these kamikaze planes might hit. So you were taking chances all through that. However, once you were out of a certain mileage area where the planes, kamikazes, could not reach, we then really were not concerned about safety. We were just concerned about getting the troops home to the United States. And so we did 3 of those extra trips. Now,
Picking up troops from where?
we picked up the troops, some who were still at Bruckner Bay, and some were in Yokohama, some were in Otaro, and we picked them up wherever they were, or wherever we were told to pick them up, and took them back to the United States. And they told us they told us, do this for San Diego, and this group goes to San Francisco. Now, I'm still in the service, and so they decide at this point they really don't need anybody on board ship to coordinate food services or anything of that. So I am now transferred to the Admiral Mayo, which is another very large troop ship. I come to the S Division, which was the storekeeper division, and here are all these young recruits. Now, I have my battle ribbons on from Europe, Asia, and so on. So these little kids are young kids. Where do you want us, sir? So, of course, I assigned them all, told them what to do. What do we do now, sir? I mean, they were just newly trained, so they would have no idea not to do this. They knew that I was the seasoned person, and they knew I had a certain amount of medals and ribbons. What do we do now, sir? Which I found very amusing. Anyway, I was on that ship then, and we made a few more, I think it was 3 more trips, bringing again troops home from the Far East. And then they decided, well, I think it's time when we can discharge you. So they put me on a train. It took us 6 days to cross the United States. And we had places that we were trying to stop: Albuquerque, New Mexico, because we came the southern route. And so we get now to Boston, which was really our home base. Whenever the ship USS Enterprise had to give their home base, it was always Boston, which we were quite familiar with. And that was interesting because now it's a different lieutenant who's in charge of me, Lieutenant Halverstein. So he said, well, John, I want to talk to you about your discharge. You know, we know your background, and we think you would make an excellent candidate for the United States Coast Guard Academy, which was in New London, Connecticut. We also know that you're an original Connecticut citizen, so we think that's what you should consider. Become or apply for enrollment in the United States Coast Guard Academy. I said, I don't think so, Lieutenant Halverstein. He says, well, look, I'll be up in my stateroom, so you think about it, and you come back and see me at 1600 hours. So I went back. I can talk to him. And so he said, well, did you decide that my suggestion might be something you'd be interested in? I said, no, thank you. I'm not really interested in going to the Coast Guard Academy. Oh, you're going to get a wonderful education, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. I said, no, I don't think so. Look, go back to your quarters and come back and see me at 2000 hours. So I did. I went back a third time. Well, I'm sure by this time you've changed your mind and you decided that you really would like to go to the Coast Guard Academy. I said, no, I'm not going to do that. Well, what are you going to do? I said, I am going to enroll in college. I'm going to be involved in education. I probably will be, with my background, a high school teacher of economics and law, and even accounting. And he said, well, where are you going to enroll? I said, not too far from here. It's in Storrs, Connecticut. It's the University of Connecticut. And that is what I'm going to do. It's going to take me 4 years, I know that. But that's what I'm going to do. And so that's what I did, and I graduated in 1950. And in 1949, Mr. Ash, who was my advisor at the university, said, we want to start you doing practice teaching. And I think because you originally came from Bridgeport, that we'll send you to Stratford High School. All I knew from Stratford High School was that they had a wonderful football team compared to Bassett High School. Anyway, so I came that spring, and I ended up with Avis Alcott, Lenola Curtis. They were the ones who were in charge of me as a young practice teacher. And so Ruth Cunningham was also involved. And so Ruth Cunningham said to me, look, next year I'm going off for a year's sabbatical. She wanted to become a guidance counselor. And so she said, my job will be open, and I'd like to recommend that you come to Stratford High then as a full-time teacher in the business department. I said, fine. Next year, Ruth comes back from her sabbatical, and now I'm out of a job. And so Linola Curtis, who was the head of the department at that time, she goes to Dr. Chafee, who is the superintendent, and she says, we cannot afford to lose this young man. We do know that Fairfield is after him, and so on and so forth. And so Chafee said, well, how about Joe Swarn? He's now taking a leave of absence for a year down in Tulane University, and his job will be available for a year. Maybe John will be interested in that. So, of course, I jumped at that job. Okay, now Joe comes back, and I don't have a full-time job. And so, all of a sudden, one of the other teachers resigns because he's going to work in Fairfield because their salary schedule was much higher than Stratford. And so now there is an opening. So Chafee said, you can have this opening. So I said, fine. He said, well, now remember, you're new, you're just starting, so you have to start at the beginning salary. Well, what I didn't know was Chafee really didn't have a salary schedule for everybody. He had individual schedules for individual teachers. So there was nothing I could do. Except the following year, all of these friends of mine, who are now very good friends because I knew them all at Stratford High, they decide I should become the president of the Teachers Association. So I do. And the NEA sends this high-powered lawyer to Stratford and to negotiate the first comprehensive teacher's contract in the state of Connecticut. And I'm to be heading it if I could get my association to really vote for it. So I had one meeting, and they all voted yes for the contract, and so Stratford became the first community in the state to have a full-time teacher's contract with a full-time teacher's schedule, pay schedule, and so on. And Bill Carroll, who later on became chairman of the board, we were in negotiations with the Teachers Association. And he says, well, John, remember, you're the one who negotiated this contract. He didn't know about the high-powered lawyer that we had from the NEA that really did the work. But anyway, he loved to throw that up to me many, many times. And so he said, now you've got to negotiate with the Teachers Association, only now you're on the other side.
So you spent how many years in Stratford School System?
34 years.
And you rose to be eventually superintendent
Yeah.
of schools.
Yeah.
How many years?
Let's see, I worked in Bridgeport just for 2.5 years. I came back to Stratford. It was 73, and I was here until 84.
And 84 is when you retired?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And, question?
I also got credit for my service time in addition to the 34 teaching or supervisory positions.
So, let's talk about reflection, because I know you go to reunions, and I know you have been in touch with some of the individuals that you served with. Talk about going back to some of these reunions. Talk about some of the people who you encountered.
Okay. Over the years, we had our first reunion in New York City in 1946. Now, I'll have a list for you to show you the various places that we've been, because we really crisscrossed the country, because we wanted to be near to where some of the other peoples resided. So we had a couple of reunions out in San Diego. We had reunions in Charleston, Savannah, Boston a couple of times. We even had a reunion in Washington, D.C. when they were dedicating the World War II monument. And so we were there. And that's interesting, Bob, and I know you'll like this one. We always have a memorial service at these reunions of the crew members who had died that previous year. So in Washington, one of my former students from the class of 1956 was Howard Pillar. I don't know if you knew Howard Pillar. Anyway, Howard became a Trinity Missions brother, and he was stationed in Silver Spring, Maryland, just outside of D.C. So I called Howard and said to Howard, "Howard, I want you to come and conduct the memorial service for my departed shipmates at the World War II monument." Wonderful. Whatever you want to do, just tell me. He was a good friend then, and he still is. Anyway, he did come, and he officiated at the service, and of course, Trinity Missions, Catholic-based, and so on. But he really included the Jewish religion, Protestant religion, and so on. He did a masterful job. Anyway, it was also interesting. This is a side story, which I probably shouldn't even get into, but it related to something we were talking about before, which was the Shakespeare Theater. Not too long ago, I had this telephone call, so I answered the phone, and on the phone is this voice who is quoting from Shakespeare. "The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth like a gentle rain upon those beneath." I said, "Is this Howard Pillar?" And of course he loved Shakespeare. And so that's how I knew who it was. But of course that was Katharine Hepburn, being Portia from The Merchant of Venice, when she was trying to straighten out Shylock, who wanted a pound of flesh. But whenever the quality of mercy is not strict, it droppeth like a gentle rain to those beneath. And I could see her.
At these reunions you've gone to, of course you've seen less and less of your
Shipmate.
And you said that at one time there were 500 aboard ship.
Yeah.
How many would you guess are coming now to the reunions? How many are?
We had our last reunion last year in 2010 in North Carolina. Simply because there were so many of us on the East Coast. And as we had been to Charleston, we'd been to Savannah, somebody decided that if we go to North Carolina, there's a U.S. Coast Guard station there, There is a Marine Air Force detachment there, and they have at Cherry Point, which is the Marines, they have a chapel that we could use for our memorial service, which the Coast Guard did not have, just a very small station. And they also have facilities there if we want to have any kind of food or anything like that. Well, as it turned out, we did go and we visited the Coast Guard station. Then we went to visit Cherry Point. At Cherry Point, they took me to where this chapel was, introduced me to the minister who was going to be officiating at our service. And also then they took me to their cafeteria, where they told me they were going to provide a luncheon for the total number, and I only had 8 members left now who came to this reunion. You see, there are so many of them who can't travel. Their doctors won't let them travel. The ones from California think it's just too far a distance, because you go through all of this nonsense traveling, getting through airports and so on. And a number of them could not come because even their families could not drive the distance from Boston, for example, down to North Carolina. So there were only 8 that showed up.
You had such a unique experience in the war. You've got so much time to reflect on this. When you think back to this, what are your reflections about what you went through?
Well, first of all, having been, in essence, all over the world, I had a free world cruise, all paid for by the U.S. Coast Guard. And I thoroughly enjoyed being able to visit these various well-known landmarks. For example, in Naples, Italy, it was Mount Vesuvius, and an experience as I sailed into that harbor to see Mount Vesuvius looming in the background. When we went to Yokohama, we were able to see Mount Fuji. It was just a wonderful time for me, because we went to Hong Kong, we went to Tsingtao, China. We really had an extensive ability aboard a ship which is now at peace because the war is over in Europe and the war is over in Japan. And so there was a marvelous opportunity for me to see all of these places that I had read about and talked about and so on. And in addition, I had these wonderful friends, because I was on that ship for the entire war for almost 3 years. So that alone was an experience, because so many of them had...
I wanted, before I forget, where is the ship?
Oh, I have to tell you, the ship was decommissioned. You'll see it on your pen. Gives you the dates when she was commissioned and decommissioned. When they decommissioned her, they put her in what was then called the Mothball Fleet, which was down in Norfolk, along with I don't know how many hundreds of other ships that were in this so-called Mothball Fleet. Unfortunately, a decision was made, probably by the Coast Guard Commandant, not to save the ship, because, of course, the new modern APAs are so much better equipped to handle invasions, but they decided that they would sell this ship for scrap metal. And that's what happened to her. It was gone.
And I didn't see a picture of the ship anywhere.
Oh, that would have been there too, and you'll get your copy when I mail you Eisenhower's message.
I'd like to see what the ship looks like.
Yeah. I have lots of pictures of the ship.
We have about concluded this interview. It only remains for me to ask you, is there anything that we didn't cover that you thought you would like to talk about, to include?
Well, just let me tell you that at this North Carolina reunion, there were only 8 shipmates who could come to this reunion. Others wrote me all kinds of notes. You see, I was the official treasurer for the USSMU Chase Association for 15 years. And that is why I know so many of these people. And of course, I had control over the bank account. So whenever anybody wanted something, they all had to contact me. But in this group now of 8 people were people who were on the ship as long as I was, almost 3 years. Pete Gaithel was one of those guys, and he came to the reunion. Dick Sheeran, who was a bosun's mate on this ship, he came to the reunion. He's from Indianapolis. Another one was Walt. Think of the name in a minute. And he now lives in Rhode Island. And he just called me 2 weeks ago to tell me his wife died. And they came to many reunions. I'm trying to picture who the others were there in North Carolina will come to me. I think I told you about one of them who was an honorary member of our association. Was the guy who was in that first wave that we landed on Omaha Beach and was wounded 6 times. Okay. He was there at this North Carolina reunion.
When is the next reunion?
That was it. I can't run any more reunions because Mary and I would be the ones who would have to make all the reunion arrangements for 8 people, and I don't know how many would show up now, because I would suspect before I know too far along that a lot of them also are in wheelchairs. Well, you know, to get through an airport in a wheelchair is not too easy. Although Mary and I always ask for a wheelchair because they whisk us right rapidly through the security check, because they figure, well, if this one's in a wheelchair, we don't think he's carrying a bomb. Anyway,
John,
we had a wonderful time. I had a wonderful experience.
thank you for serving our country. And thank you on a personal note for being one of the people who personally touched my life and did so much for me. I appreciate it and never forget that. And for the number of students that you reached out to that they love you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for serving our country.
Thank you.